Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we're talking about Woodrow Wilson, 14 points, Henry Cabot Lodge, who has come up quite a bit, I think, in previous episodes, and some of the speeches on the Versailles Treaty. So we have Dr. Sean Beienburg with us. Dr. Beienburg, let's start with the 14 points. What are Woodrow Wilson's 14 points?
So Woodrow Wilson's 14 points are kind of his vision of how World War I ought to be concluded. Mm-hmm. So we probably should say a little bit about World War I itself. So backstory, in 1915, the Germans sink the Lusitania, which is a British ship carrying arms as it sails from America. So carrying arms is kind of a problem for rules of war. About 100 Americans die on the boat. Americans are quite angry. So Germany then says they won't sink vessels without ensuring the safety of passengers and non-combatants. They don't want to drag America into the war at this point. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson runs as an anti-war candidate with a slogan gloating that he has kept the U.S. out of World War I. This is enough to get him reelected, because by this point, the Republican Party, which had split in 1912, right, Roosevelt and Taft, it's reunified. Charles Evans Hughes he left the Supreme Court to run for president, which is wild. He'll go back on the Supreme Court later. Wilson wins New Hampshire by 50 votes, and he barely wins California. And California is a Republican-leaning state, but Hughes had apparently pissed off Hiram Johnson, who was the powerful senator there. So he didn't put his machine only sort of halfway did it. So Hughes goes to bed thinking he's president, and he wakes up in the morning when the California votes have come in, and he is not president.
Oh, no.
So Wilson is president, reelected, after having basically said, yep, I'm not doing the war. Well, events somewhat force his hands. The so-called Zimmerman telegram has been released, in which Germany tells Mexico that if they'll get on board and with World War I and America gets beaten, then they'll get Texas and the Southwest back. But Americans do not declare war. They're mad about that. The fact that Germany's like, maybe we should drag America in and beat them down now. But Germany resumes unlimited submarine warfare to choke off England and France. And they torpedo an American vessel, and Wilson basically says, look, at this point, my hands are tied. I tried to keep us out, but the Germans are just acting crazy. So he asks for a declaration of war, and he gets it. Russia pulls out during World War I when the Communist Revolution deposes what becomes the Russian Revolution, which will eventually become sort of the Communist Revolution. Basically incapacitates Russia and removes them. So at that point, politics is looking a little different. But by the time the U.S. gets in, or with the U.S.'s contribution, there's going to be a winner. And it's not going to be Germany. So Wilson releases a vision of sort of 14 points of what he wants the terms to look like. He has other terms. So he wants Germany to have relatively lenient terms because he doesn't want to piss them off. The British and the French, understandably, have had, particularly France. I mean, France is totally destroyed by World War I. And so for Wilson to say let the Germans off easy is not very palatable. He might be right as a geostrategic matter. That's above my pay grade. But this is just, again, as I've said, Wilson is a professor. He's not somebody that understands people. So when he's sitting in a room and saying, Britain, France, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. They're a little frustrated. Whereas France wants, no, Germany can't have an army, pay us back, and we want some territorial concessions. No. So Wilson, again, is now spelling out how do we make this thing so that some good happens from it. And so he wants to have the U.S. work to make the world a broadly freer place. Sometimes this gets pitched as a war to end all wars. Roosevelt's saying the same thing, although Roosevelt will be against the League of Nations, which we'll come back to. Now, Wilson is proposing a very sharp shift from George Washington's vision of non-intervention. We think we've had one, maybe two podcasts earlier that covered the farewell address, which is don't get involved in entangling alliances. World War I, in fact, Wilson is very careful. He will not call them allies. He will not say that this is an alliance. And so there's separate command. Like he was trying to maintain, like, no, we're not getting dragged in, but because he has some level of deference to that old understanding that you do not get the U.S. permanently entangled. And so the 14 points, they have a few sections to it. So one, you don't have these secret treaties. This is part of what happens. Like, haha, we have a secret treaty with you. Well, we have a secret treaty with you. And it turns out everybody's all got secret treaties.
Everybody's got secret treaties with everybody.
Yeah. And so even countries that's not really in their best interest get sort of sucked in to World War I. So like, no, we don't do these sort of secret treaties thing. We want to have freedom of the seas. We want to have some levels of disarmament. We want to have a way to, deal with colonial claims. So Belgium basically gets independence, French. So there's some like sort of territorial. We don't need to get into the details of all that. But the complicated stuff comes in points, I would say like 9 to 13, which is we're going to start breaking up some empires. We're going to break up Austria-Hungary. We're going to break up the Ottoman Empire, which also had its own revolution, that the Ottomans had been overthrown basically by secular military folks rather than sort of the religious leadership. So, what do we do with what was part of Turkey? We cut that up. We're going to recarve Poland out. So they're trying to effectively, the short kind of version of all that, the theme, is they want to make nations and states coterminous. Now, what do I mean by that? A state is a government, a political community.
Okay.
A nation is a sort of group of people with a common heritage, language, culture, tradition, right? Again, there's going to be some fuzziness in this. But like France is both a nation and a state, right? Austria-Hungary is not a nation and a state because it's Austrians and Hungarians and other chunks of the Balkans that are basically governed by those folks. The Ottoman Empire is not a nation state because it is a state of Turks that are also governing, chunks of the Arab world and whatnot. So the overall theme that Wilson is pushing here is that nations and states should look more similar. So you don't have basic, because that's been sort of the cause of World War I, is right. Basically, Serbian nationalists wanting to overthrow what they viewed as an imperial power over them. Well, that requires some modifying of borders and things, but there are also some places where Wilson's not quite willing to go that far. So point 5, he says, a free, open-minded, and impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon an observance of the principle that the sovereignty of the populations must have equal weight with the claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Which is to say, there are some folks that, we got to make sure we're taking care of the imperial governments too. And Wilson is not that keen on pushing for, in his other writings, he does say, look, eventual independence for basically non-European countries should happen, but like they need training wheels for a while. So he is not an anti-imperialist and like, India should be released from Britain tomorrow kind of thing, right? Again, not that surprising considering what we know about Wilson's views on other things. More or less what I said before is not that controversial for lots of folks. In America, the big deal is the 14th point. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. This is the League of Nations. And so what he wants is basically a league of non-aggression where if you attack one of the countries that's in this league, everybody else will gang up and hammer you. And so the idea is this will basically deter wars of aggression. And so he said, and he goes around the country pushing this. This is not that popular in America because people still are into their George Washington theory. They're like, hey,
Yes.
We don't give a damn what happens in Europe. You leave us alone in the Western Hemisphere, we will leave you alone and we'll be good. Now, Wilson is in trouble because he's in poor health and he had not been that popular at the Versailles negotiations. And he's not that good because, again, he's mostly just like, hey, France and Britain, suck it up. And he's not that politically savvy in America either, because there end up being two factions of people that are against the League of Nations. There's one faction that's mostly progressive Westerners and Midwesterners, and these are called the Irreconcilables. It's a great name. And these are the folks that say,
that is a really great name.
Under no circumstances will we sign off on the League of Nations. We don't do alliances. We don't give a damn. We don't care what happens to Europe. We don't care. We don't care. Not our problem. There are a fair number of them, but that's not enough to sink it.
Okay.
There's a third faction, and this is Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge leads basically a faction of mostly conservative Republicans who say, we're on board with the treaty, we're on board with a league, but we will not tolerate it being self-executing. And this is a complicated thing, but basically, we do not think America can be dragged into a war because the League asked us to. We need to make sure that Congress has the authority to say, in order to enforce the League, war is declared against X, Y, and Z. And so he gives various speeches saying it's inconsistent, it's bad enough to throw George Washington under the bus, but maybe we have to do that. He's skeptical of that, so he doesn't want to have too much aggression, too much participation. But his main objection is that there seems something wrong with sending American young people off to die in a country that Congress never even said, yep, we're good with this. And so Lodge basically says, renegotiate the treaty, throw in a proviso that Congress basically has to approve, and Lodge's faction will deal with it. Wilson, by this point, is not only cranky because he's a cranky professor type, but he's in bad health. He's got a stroke. His wife is possibly actually the president. This is his own, is Edith Wilson actually the president?
Yes.
So Wilson just says, nope, no negotiations. Well, Lodge is basically Lodge's faction of persuadable skeptics, and the Irreconcilables is enough to say that sinks the treaty. So the U.S. does not get engaged in the League of Nations, I would say largely because Wilson won't sort of play ball with Lodge. And this ends up becoming sort of this remains a live issue when the League of Nations gets sort of revived as the United Nations later. Is a United Nations authorization sufficient? Truman argues it is in Korea. Others are skeptical of that, and you get sort of secondary Lodge version called the effort for the Bricker Amendment during Eisenhower. But that's jumping ahead a whole bunch of years. So that's your takeaway. Wilson has this very idealistic vision of using political power to sort of remake the world for freedom, which is why Wilson is often regarded as sort of as a father of kind of an idealistic interventionist foreign policy, which, in some sense, George W. Bush will pick that up, saying we need to sort of remake the Middle East to be friendly for democracy, which has some echoes of Wilson. So it's not, and otherwise, Wilson and George W. Bush are not close ideologically. So it cuts foreign policy, as it often does, cuts across domestic policy lines. But yeah, Wilson wants the League, and he wants to have the U.S. sort of Wilson isn't saying we need to invade, China to end imperialism or invade these places to stop it, but use as much of its soft power as it can. Again, and Lodge very much is taking the sort of constitutionally cautious version of that may be, but you can't amend the Constitution by a treaty vote. You need to amend the Constitution if we're doing that, or we could just make it easy and amend the treaty so that we just have to get Congress's permission.
It's so interesting because the text of the 14 points is not long at all.
No, it's not.
And he talks about Russia, who I definitely went through a phase in, I think, my 20s of the House of the Romanovs and the dynasty and, all of that thing. But why would it be important for us, especially in an age where World War I is so far away for us? Why is this document itself still important to study?
Well, so, I mean, particularly there's a couple of questions of should nations and states look the same in their borders, right? Like, this was a big part of why Iraq was a mess over there, because Iraq is Shia and Sunnis and Kurds. In some sense, it's three cultures that are bolted together because at the end of World War I, when they're drawing up particularly what's left of the Ottoman Empire, they actually don't do a very good job of drawing up the nations and states co-align, right? Lebanon is the same thing, right? So they kind of try to do it, but it doesn't work, or populations change. But like, this is still a live issue today. You know, you're seeing versions of this, you know, it plays out differently, but, you know, the argument that like Ukraine isn't really a nation, right? And so like you get versions. So the same kinds of conversations of should nations and states, at least in, you know, it's not really applicable in the United States in the same way, but what's the relationship between those two? So that's still a debate in foreign policy. The debate about to what extent should U.S. power, hard or soft, be used to sort of advance a version of sort of liberal democracy. That's a debate, you know, versus what level of sort of isolationism versus a sort of, you know, the isolationism label gets thrown around, I think, too cavalierly to people who are probably closer. Like, Lodge is not an isolationist. And there are people today who get tagged as isolationists who are not. But there are also people who are actual isolationists, right? So what's the role of the United States in that? Again, it goes back to like why we studied the farewell address. It carries on that. And then finally, the relationship between, you know, whether it's the UN or NATO, like they're different things, but to what extent should the U.S. be making these extensions of basically a guarantee that we will militarily intervene? Under what circumstances do you do that? You know, the UN expands beyond the League of Nations in some ways. So it's not just League of Nations version 2 or renamed. It's different. So, you know, you have debates about to what extent the U.S. ought to be participating in some of these multinational, multilateral kinds of treaties or things like that, right? So, yeah, as you said, a lot of the specifics, like what should the Romanian territory look like, that feels pretty alien. But the sort of under the hood debates about the League of Nations really do engage questions of what's the capability of foreign policy to make political change in countries, under what circumstances should the U.S. extend its security guarantees or not, under what circumstances, I guess this is more on the Lodge piece, under what circumstances must Congress be involved in war making? So I think those are all still pretty relevant. You can read Lodge's speeches today, and most of them are actually, you could read most of Lodge's like speeches that he's giving in the League of Nations, and they're not even that specific to like the particular context. It's about separation of powers. It's about intervention versus non-intervention. The Wilson piece is a little more specific to that time, but it's broadly part of Wilson's other stuff. So I think it's definitely still a text worth engaging with. The Lodge pieces people don't always assign. I've always been very adamant that if you assign the Wilson, you need to assign the Lodge because A, we've got more of a constitution focus, which I care about.
Yeah.
But B, I think it raises, again, and Lodge is not like one of the hardcore irreconcilables that's just like throwing a fit. Like he actually is trying to balance things. I'm not saying he's right necessarily, but like, yeah, I'm sympathetic to him, but the Lodge is definitely worth reading. His speeches in February 28th and August 12th, if you're looking for the specific ones.
Yes, the February 28th one, there is a line in it. I've always loved one flag, and I cannot share that devotion with a mongrel banner created for a league. And then he really just goes on to talk about like his allegiance to, to the flag and to our nation. And it is a great pairing to, again, just talk about these conversations that were being had about the League of Nations, but just, essentially politically in 1919. So absolutely. Henry Cabot Lodge, I think, he's just come up a lot lately. He is somebody, I don't know that we study a whole lot in history, but he sure had a lot to say.
he and Elihu Root are two people that were big deals at the time who have fallen away. I think, for at least for people who are serious about political history, are worth spending some time with, because they are not just political pundits, or like they are like thoughtful, like scholar participants in a way that we don't often see so much anymore.
Maybe those could be good future podcast episodes. Dr. Beienburg, thank you so much. I think that sometimes we get into World War I and we talk a lot about like the battles and things that were happening, but really, the writings and looking at Wilson's 14 points in the conversation that surrounded it and surrounded are essentially never joining the League of Nations. And I'm sure we'll talk in future podcast episodes about the League of Nations' eventual failure. But all of these political writings, are really, really important. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.